I'm joined by Dr. Saroj Narala. He's an associate professor of medicine at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada. He's talking about a new paper looking at whether or not we can do randomized control trials for all of these cancer drugs we approve on the basis of single-arm, uncontrolled data. Below, I'm going to put links to 3 papers we talk about. And, well, this paper is good, but unfortunately, in the course of our dialogue, we had one internet hiccup. The internet went away for a while. I've done my best to mend it, but please forgive me. So, with that, I introduce Saroj Narala. I'm back in plenary session, virtual edition. Unfortunately, it's just virtual edition. I'm joined by the great Saroj Narala. Dr. Narala is associate professor in my favorite place, University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. Saroj, it's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you, Vinay, for your invitation. I've always been an admirer of the type of work you do and the things that you bring up in your podcast. I think these things were discussed in isolation by a handful of people before, but you really have brought these things in the forefront of academic discussion. So thank you for what you do. And obviously, it's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much for saying that. I think I admire your work as well, because I think you and I are both interested in very similar issues, of course. And listeners are going to learn that through the course of this podcast. But I certainly don't pretend to, to know everything about this space. And I learned a lot along the way. And I learned a lot from your recent paper.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Yeah. And so I don't know. Well, first I'll just say how I was looking online, and then I saw, I think you tweeted it or somebody quote tweeted it. And then I saw this paper and I said, damn it, this is so good. This is so good. And I said, how come this is not a plenary session discussion? And I said, it ought to be. It ought to be, because it's really one of the most interesting papers I've read in a long time in cancer drug policy. And you know me, I read a lot of cancer drug policy papers. So first, I want to commend you for that. And so that's what brings you here. But first, why don't you tell listeners a little bit what your clinical practice is like, how you spend your clinical time and your research interests. And then we're going to jump into this paper, which is about RCTs in cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for noticing the paper. I thought nobody's going to read it. Anyway, so I am a medical oncologist. I am working in Cancer Care Manitoba, University of Manitoba for a few years now. My clinical focus is mainly breast cancer in outpatient setting and all solid tumors in inpatient setting. And I do some cancer policy work, drug approval, drug regulation type things, and more recently, some work in global oncology space. So that's who I am in a nutshell.
That's who you are. And I think people will be reading your paper, especially when I'm done talking about this. Here's what it's called: Feasibility of Randomized Control Trials for Cancer Drugs Approved by the US FDA based on single-arm studies. Your first author is Rebecca Rittberg, and you can tell us.
Yeah, I had planned to bring her, but she was a fellow here. She has transitioned to more training to a different province, so I couldn't get her in. But yes, that's led by Rebecca.
And your middle author is Peter, who I think is your section chief, is he not?
He was previously a section chief. He is the chief medical officer of Cancer Care Manitoba at present. Okay. And he's also interested in these kind of works.
So this is interesting. So, you and I both know, maybe let's just remind the listeners need to know, US FDA is approving a lot of cancer drugs. And as they tell us, more drugs means more innovation. They like to remind us, more drugs means more innovation. What else could it mean? Obviously not better drugs, which is what, you and I care about. Yep. Of the drugs they approve, 1/3 are based on progression-free survival, which in a randomized study, typically 1/3 overall survival in a randomized study with a median OS of about 2.1 months-ish. Mm-hmm. And then 1/3 based on response rate, which means, we gave drug to 100 people and it's what percent have 30% or more tumor shrinkage. And people who do those single-arm response rate studies, they have lots of reasons why they didn't do a randomized control trial. And you, in this paper, you're interrogating one of those reasons. But I wonder if you might explain how you came to think of this idea. It's so clever.
That would be a good segue to start this. So yeah, first of all, I think I should start by clarifying something that is likely to be misunderstood about this paper from the outset, because the misunderstanding in the primary argument will only lead to further, more misapprehension and things like that. So the idea of the paper is not to go against FDA's accelerated approval pathway itself. In fact, I'm a strong believer that this pathway is a remarkable asset that FDA has. And this can offer tremendous value to millions of patients, no doubt about that. So the accelerated approval pathway itself is not a problem. The problem, in fact, lies in the way that this pathway, accelerated approval pathway, is currently being utilized. As you like to say, it's not the fault of the aeroplane itself, but the number of seats that the company puts into it and makes and creates a problem of this miracle that we have of a flying vessel, right? So what I have observed, Vinay, and you obviously have observed as well, is that whenever a new government program or a new service to the public are started, they are generally started out of necessity, and there's usually a genuine impetus to start something new of service to the public. And it holds true not only for healthcare or cancer drug approvals, but also in other aspects of the state, like some social programs, some economic programs, and whatnot. But then when such programs are started, they eventually take the life of their own. There will be people whose livelihood will start to depend on that, and politics comes into play, and there will be people who whose career will depend on either supporting or not supporting or opposing such programs. So something that's initially started for a certain purpose will evolve over time and start serving a different purpose. And I think accelerated approval pathway is one such programs. As you are aware, and your listeners are definitely, most of them are aware, that the accelerated pathway was started out of necessity and with very good intentions in around 1992, when there was a need for rapid approval of the HIV/AIDS drugs, which couldn't wait for a long time until the generation of good evidence. So that gave birth to accelerated approval as a temporary provision. The idea was that the patient will have access to promising new drugs when there is a reasonable preliminary evidence. And in FDA's own word, if there is a reasonable likelihood that the drug is going to improve outcome, the meaningful outcomes. So it was all well and good. And it did work without any major hiccups for almost a decade or so, until mid 2000s, or mainly after 2010, when the tsunami of cancer drugs started to overwhelm medicine as a whole, right? So now the program was initiated in the best interest of the patients who are dealing with terminal illness, and we really needed to do something about it. But they do not have and people who did not have any good treatment options. But the program right now is not being used in the way it was initially designed, and it has now been used as an excuse to bring marginal or even questionable interventions in the market, as you have been speaking in your podcast. So our study was really a thought experiment. In not too distant future, cancer drugs were approved based on reasonable evidence from randomized controlled trials, but that has been compromised. Conventionally, single-arm studies in drug development process was exclusively for conduct of phase 1 clinical trials to establish efficacy and find the dose. It was not designed for regulatory approval at all. Even when I was a fellow less than a decade ago, regulatory approval based on single-arm study would be rare to find. But the world seems to have changed in the last few years drastically. As you can see there, you can see very high proportion of new cancer drugs that are approved based on single-arm study of say 31, 42, 29 patients based on response alone. And even you can remember from your fellowship years, a few years ago, that to see a New England Journal paper of a brand new drug based on single-arm study was a rare thing to happen. And much worse, to tout such papers as practice changing was even not heard of too much. So I think so I guess I think I have spoken too much about the rationale. So I'll jump right into so most common rationale that is provided to FDA and to us to defend new drug approval based on single-arm studies are a few rationales. A, the randomized controlled trials are not feasible because there are not enough patients. B, it takes a long time. Randomized control trial takes a long time, so it's not worth waiting. And C, there is no good alternative for the disease conditions. And related to that, randomizing patients to placebo would not be ethical. So we just wanted to empirically test whether these things are true or they're just plain lies. So what we did was we looked at all cancer drugs that were approved in the last decade, that is 2010 to 2019, based on response rate in single arm studies in solid tumors. And then we designed hypothetical randomized control trials to assess theoretically how many of those approvals would be possible to be approved based on randomized control trials rather than a single arm study alone. So for each of the drug approvals on the basis of single arm studies, we designed randomized control trials to assess the feasibility of performing the RCTs, both in terms of statistics as well as in a pragmatic way. In terms of statistics, we looked at power and sample size needed to detect the expected difference. And in the real life setting, we looked at feasibility of conducting those trials on time, and whether there would be enough number of eligible patients to complete it. So that was what we did. And power and sample size calculation for randomized control trial was done to really match how contemporary oncology clinical trials are done, which is not that
control arms.
Yeah, so I'm coming to that. So as long as we have a few variables, we can design trials. So what we need is what is the standard of care? What is the current existing standard of care? So we got that from review of literature for that disease condition, whatever is being used before the drug approval based on the single arm study. And then the single arm studies offered us with what to expect of the new intervention. And then we got the delta, which helped us to design the trial. And that will take care of the statistics part of designing randomized control trial. And the next question is feasibility, which depends on the number of eligible patients that we can accrue and the time it takes to accrue. For that, we use SEER database, which will give you both the incidence and mortality of the cancer types. And to be conservative, our assumption was that we calculated the number of patients that might be eligible based on death rate rather than incidence. Right. So we assumed that,
using a lot of our papers, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And we assume that less than 5% of patients that die of the specific condition would accrue to the trial. So should I go to the result now?
In 1 second, I think you hit so many good points. I just want to highlight them so the listeners have them forefront of mind. Number one, the FDA approves a lot of drugs based on response rate, probably 1 in 3 drugs. Number two, accelerated approval is something you philosophically agree with. However, it's important that we do randomized control trials at some point to really know if new drugs are better than alternatives. Number three, just because a drug has this is maybe a point we didn't make, but we should make explicit. Just because a drug has a better response rate than another drug doesn't always mean people live longer or live better with the new drug versus the older drug, which is why we really need the randomized controlled trials. We can all think of examples of really great response rates that went nowhere. One drug I think of is iodine-131 tositumumab or Bexar, the lymphoma drug. And now it's off the market, even though the response rate is like 65%. So that's an important point. Response rate doesn't always mean the winner. And number four, I think the clever part of your paper is you say that there are these excuses people give, like why we can't do a randomized trial. And what you're saying is, well, let me give you the most credit possible. We're going to assume a very small percentage of people who would otherwise die could enroll, 5%, which is kind of roughly in line with what US enrollment is in papers by Kerry Gross and others over the years. 5% of people will enroll. Let's assume we're doing this randomized control trial measuring a real outcome. And let's assume that the control arm is going to do as well as it's going to do, and your drug will do this much. So what could we do those randomized trials? I think that's the premise of your paper.
Yes, very well summarized. I couldn't have said it better. So thank you for the summary.
Results. Yeah, now tell me what you found.
Yes, so some of the results will shock your listeners. So there were 171 approvals during the 10-year period, and 31 of them were based on single-arm studies in solid tumors. So we didn't take into account hematological malignancies because the response in hematological malignancy means it gets complicated. So we focused on solid tumors only, and which is also my area of expertise. So as expected, there was a steep increase in the number of approvals in based on single-arm studies from 0 approvals in 2010 to 8 approvals in 2019. So there was a steep increase. Which is really a factor that raised our curiosity into looking
that means more innovation, sir.
More innovation, more and more innovation, more discoveries, more discoveries that you couldn't wait for randomized controlled trials. So all were approvals for metastatic disease, not for curative setting, and 100% of the studies reported overall response rate. Only about half of them reported duration of response, and only 20% reported progression-free survival. About 20% also reported overall survival. So only 1/5 reported time to event outcome, and only half reported duration of response. 100% overall response. The size of single-arm studies ranged from about 23 patients in one trial to quite sizable trial of over 400 patients. But
a single-arm study, wow.
Yeah, 400 patient single-arm study, and you argue that you cannot do randomized control trial for that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So mostly it was in the lower end of the spectrum. 15 of them had less than 100 patients, and many of them had less than 50 patients. And almost 80% of the approvals were accelerated approval. There were few approvals that were full approvals. So a rarity of cancer had no correlation with single-arm study, which is presented as one of the rationale for conducting this. So
let me just pause that one again.
Yes.
And say, what you're saying is the incidence with which a cancer occurs, its rarity, had nothing to do with whether or not they were doing single-arm or randomized.
No.
And actually, you're the second person to my knowledge who showed that. I actually think there's an old FDA paper by Rick Pazder, where he showed us incidence fell from 6 per 100,000 to 1 per 100,000. There's no difference in the fraction of approvals that were based on uncontrolled data. So I think
Yeah, obviously he's a respectable person, but some of the statements about about accelerated approval that he has said, there are things that can be said in a different forum probably. Anyway, so moving on. So for example, lung cancer, I don't think any person who treats cancer, an oncologist would call lung cancer a very rare cancer that you cannot do a randomized control trial on. But about 22% of the approvals were in lung cancer, based on single-arm study, because you couldn't do randomized control trials. That was followed by 20% of the studies which were urothelial carcinoma, pelvis of the kidney, bladder, and the lining. So 20% of the approvals. Ovarian cancer, 10% of the approvals. So take a moment to think about it. If we start considering lung cancer, bladder cancer, ovarian cancer as being rare enough to justify approval based on single-arm study, I guess we're in quite a shaky ground to begin with in the whole issue.
And somebody might say that these mutations are rare, but even if you multiply the mutations by the raw number of people with new lung cancer, it's still massive. Right?
I have given the number in the second paragraph of discussion if your readers want to read. So we did specifically, when we calculated feasibility, we did look into the incidence of that particular, because so EGFR, ALK, rearrangement, and ROS1, they constitute 17%, 7%, and 2% of all non-small cell lung cancer. And in absolute number, that translates into 19,000 patients, 8,000 patients, and 1,200 patients per year in the United States alone. Right. So, 19,000 patients is not...
10,000. Like Hodgkin's is 10,000, and we have like 1,000 randomized trials. And
exactly. So that tells you how shaky the ground is. Yeah. So almost half of the approvals consisted of immunotherapy, and we can talk as long as you want about the significance of response rate in immunotherapy. Now, something that will probably shock your listeners, Vinay, is the following: there were a few drugs that were approved despite the evidence that existing therapy used for that condition might result into superior outcome, even for response rate, compared to the new drug assessed based on single-arm study, and the approval was given. Yes. Whereas there was alternative which
had a higher response rate
with a better response rate.
Yeah. Allison Haslam and I looked at that once previously in a paper. We didn't do this extra step that you've done, but we did find like maybe 1 in 5 of these drugs approved single arm. There's a better drug out there that you're already using.
Exactly. Yeah, and this really throws cold waters in the face of whole drug approval process, to be honest, because, and there can be reasons where you would want to do that if the new drug has certain advantages, like for in terms of convenience, route of administration, other toxicities. But we also looked at that and did not find that the new drug would have any advantages on that regard either. So another point worth noting is that I really think the overall response rate alone is incomplete information. Yes, it does tell you that there is some biological activity of the drug, but in a non-comparative fashion, and it tells you very little about how helpful the response is going to be to the patient. The response could last 2 weeks, 1 month, 1 year, 2 year, and each of those duration will have major impact on how you view the drug. But about 50% of the single-arm studies did not provide that information, meaning that duration of response was not reported in half of those patients. So if you report, I don't think duration of response would be a difficult thing to measure and report. Yeah. And in my opinion, it would actually be, important to report duration of response if you're trying to use single-arm studies for drug approval process with a clean heart. But that was not reported, which is strange.
One thing we should say is sometimes listeners have emailed me to say, what is the difference between median PFS and median DOR? And the explanation is median progression-free survival is the time until the 50th percentile patient in a study in one arm or the other has a progression-free survival event, which is either death or progression. Median duration of response is only in the fraction of people who achieve a response, which may not be everybody, maybe 10%, 20%, 30%. Just in that cohort, what is the median time until they have progression in that cohort, right? And so exactly. It's really variable,
Yeah, and to complete the argument and to be fair to the other side, one genuine reason one wouldn't report duration of response is if the patients continued to respond and median duration of response had not been reached at the time of reporting. But I don't think that was the case for any of the studies that we looked at here, based on the timing of study conduction, based on the final study report and the FDA approval. So that was not the reason.
I see. Good. Okay, go on to the results.
Yeah. So now moving on to the main results, okay, the feasibility of randomized control trials. So we designed hypothetical randomized control trials using 3 primary endpoints individually: with overall response rate, progression-free survival, and overall survival, whenever those were reported. With overall response rate as primary endpoint, median sample size needed to conduct a randomized control trial was 206. And these were all designed based on conventional assumptions like power of 0.8, alpha error of 0.05. So what conventional contemporary trial design practice were used. And we have described that in the methods section. Medium sample size to conduct with a randomized control trial with overall response rate was 206 patients. This number is actually smaller than what was used for single-arm studies in 1/3 of
one third. It's smaller.
1/3 was smaller. Yes.
So we have to emphasize
which tells you that rarity of the tumor or lack of patients to enroll. It's certainly not the reason single-arm study was used for those.
1 out of 3 of these cases, you have already enrolled enough people to have done the randomized control trial with that.
There you go. Wow. Exactly.
Unbelievable.
And nor could we find any other reasons that would support avoiding randomized controlled trials, right? And no other advantages like as I said earlier, route of administration or increased convenience or better cost. Those were not the reasons. So taken overall, we found that about 85% of the randomized controlled trials with overall response rate as primary endpoint could be completed within 2 years, based on less than 5% of eligible United States patients being enrolled in such RCT, let alone multinational studies. We're only talking about United States patients. Similarly, for progression-free survival, 19 out of 31 single-arm studies reported progression-free survival, in addition to overall response rate. And median sample size to conduct such a randomized control trial was 130. 95% of such trials could be completed in equal to or less time than what was necessary for single-arm studies.
Wow.
Almost all, 90% of randomized control would be completed within 24 months. Almost all.
When you analyze it this way, I feel like the conclusion is inescapable, which is that even if you believe there is a time and a place to use response rate to approve a drug, you are using it way more than that, because in many cases it would have been faster, simpler, more informative for patients and doctors to have done the randomized trial.
Yeah, you're just losing your grounds. Like there's no hiding. There's no secret that remains. In terms of overall survival, similar was the story. Only about 7 out of 31 reported overall survival data. Median sample size to conduct a reasonably powered randomized control trial based on overall survival as the primary endpoint was 392 patients. So that was a little bit higher, and 80%. So accrual for 80% of the patients with overall survival endpoint could be completed within the time frame needed to complete the respective single arm studies for those drugs. Yeah, and 100% of those trials with overall survival endpoint could be completed within 24 months based on how many patients we have for those trials. So even if we enroll less than 5% patients in the United States alone, okay, and very few clinical trials currently are conducted in just one country, right? So that opens up, that makes you available a lot more patients. So
if anything, it would have gone faster. If anything, it would have gone faster.
Yeah, exactly. So our claim is that basically replacing most of the single arm study with randomized control trials would have been absolutely possible in pragmatic sense, not just in theory.
Now, why do you think this is happening?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there is a number of things at play. So first, I think it's the nature of the problem itself, that it is in healthcare. Second is the incentive system that is in support of such practice in academic world. And third is that there is a strong and wealthy pharmaceutical industry whose best interest is served by continuing such practice. So I think I'll speak briefly about each of these. So now, if it was driven by profit alone, I don't think this practice would last very long. A car salesperson, for example, cannot deceive you for very long. Housing market will not exceed a person's ability to pay, right? So I think the combination of profit and apparent altruism that is embedded in this makes it easy for manipulations. And I think so because, humans are driven by emotions, and availability of drug for a fellow human being who is dying is a powerful logic to sway even highly objective people. And objectivity tends to get lost when you or your loved one is dealing with some terminal cancer. So it's therefore easy to create and sell altruistic story around healthcare. So I think that's one of the reasons. The other reason is academic incentives that are aligned. The chances that you secure a New England Journal of paper as first author within the first few years of your faculty position, it's best if you just carry the banner of a new sexy drug company. And it's great if the drug is also helpful for the patient, but really it doesn't have to be that way. What seems to be more important lately is that the drug is new, has some novel mechanism of action, at least in papers, and the company is willing to risk developing it. So that's all it is necessary, rather than the weight that the drug bears. So that is the disconnect that I'm talking about here. So our incentives are not aligned with helping patients and improving drug development process overall. So I think that is one of the reasons. The other reason really is the power of, and before we go there, the power of incentives to humans should never be underestimated, because it has direct, it's a direct hack of your reward system in the brain. If you keep rewarding low value practices, if your next promotion will depend on cheerleading a mediocre drug and forming unhealthy collaboration, you can never expect novelty from your actions. To make a person noble, you have to reward the novelty. If you reward crookery, you will just produce a bunch of crooks. And for example, you cannot expect a mango fruit from an apple tree, right? So you have to plant mango tree for that. So research from as we know from research from some development psychology space, that we humans are still highly hierarchical organisms, right? So you're giving people the hit of dopamine and serotonin. With that, these are addictive chemicals that occur naturally in our brain. So you are expected to do exactly the things that will, readily improve your hierarchy in the academic world. And that happens only if currently that is happening if you lead a single arm study, get your FDA approved. You are automatically counted as a leader in the field instantly. So I think we need to be careful about how we align our incentives. So that's my second thought why this is happening. My final thought is obviously the powerful pharma industry. Now, first and foremost, I should acknowledge that some of the most useful therapeutics have been developed by pharmaceutical company. Without the partnership of pharma, some of the discoveries would not see the light of the day. But we should recognize, regardless of how noble a drug company may claim itself to be, and I'm fine with accepting that may be partly true, their primary motive is to make profit. Their whole existence depends on their ability to make profit, and you cannot just develop a drug and go bankrupt, right? You cannot expect that from a pharmaceutical company. And I don't blame industry for trying their hard to finding loopholes in drug regulation that will increase their wealth. Honestly, Vinay, if you make me the CEO of Novartis or Pfizer, I would do exactly the same thing, or even do even more things in my capacity that I might know more to increase the profit of the company. That behavior is not surprising at all. Any other behavior would be unnatural. So the tragedy lies in that academics who also appear to blindly support the motive of industry, and it's the misfortune that is facing drug development in contemporary medicine. Academics are supposed to be gatekeepers for such wrongdoings, and I blame the leaders in my fraternity, academic medicine, for not recognizing the fact and to be honest, turning a blind eye, because I know they are smart. They know these things. So yeah, that's all I have. And what I would say before we part is, I guess I would say that pharmaceutical industry is an essential partner in drug development, and we can make the best of that partnership if we keep a respectable distance between each other. The relationship has to be mutually uplifting rather than abusive. I think the chances that the relationship will become abusive increases if you start being too uncomfortably cozy, a relationship between the two. Or in other words, you can still contribute meaningfully to drug development and help patients with healthy partnership. Because I guess I should use the word, prostitution has never been regarded as respectable attribute in our race in the history, and that's for a reason. And although it might be tempting at times compared to monogamous relationship with academia, I think you lose prestige and you lose all your virtues by doing that.
Suraj Narola, it's a fascinating paper. I'm going to direct listeners to it. And thanks for taking time and putting up with our technical difficulties. And it's great to speak with you. Great to speak with you.
Pleasure, Vinay. Thank you for inviting.